I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
Briella Osborne has been working for 2 years as the assistant to the most powerful and most dangerous man in New York. Professional, organized, and always in control. She had just one rule: never get involved with the boss. That's why there's a hidden file on her computer called Things I Will Never Do. And item number 1 on the list is crystal clear: never get involved with Niccolo Angelis. The problem is that one night in a nearly empty office while talking to her best friend on the phone, Briella made a mistake. She said out loud something she should never have said. My dream is to see him without his pants. What she didn't know is that Niccolo Angelis was standing right behind her. And now the most dangerous man in the Italian mob in New York knew exactly what his assistant wanted. Chapter 1. My dream is to see him without his pants. Tuesday, 6:43 p.m. The office was empty, or so I thought. I had stayed late because that was what I did every day for the past 2 years, and I had long since stopped finding it worth mentioning. Gwen was on speakerphone while I finished the report, and undid the bun I'd pulled too tight since 9 in the morning, and my hair fell down my neck with that small relief of something that had been held in place for too long. So he actually said that to you? Gwen's voice came through the phone with the curiosity of someone who already knows the answer and wants to hear it anyway. He said I'm organizationally irritating, I answered, spinning my chair slightly, with that smile. What smile? She asked, and I heard her smile before she even finished the question. Gwen, describe it. I looked at the ceiling for a second, weighing how much I wanted to feed into this conversation, and then decided it would be quick and to the point, and that I would drop the subject right after. The smile of someone who knows he's going to walk away with 0 consequences because he's good looking, I said, in the tone of someone cataloging objective data, not expressing a personal opinion. He's good looking? She asked, and there was something in the question I didn't like. Absurdly, I answered, before I could filter myself. That's neutral information. Of course, she said, and I could tell she didn't find it neutral in the slightest. It is, I insisted, because sometimes the only option is to hold your ground. Briella, what? You just described your boss's smile using 3 adjectives. 2, I corrected, because precision matters. Good-looking and absurdly is one with an intensifier. Gwen laughed, and I spun the chair to reach the charger that had fallen behind the desk, turning my back to the door, with absolutely no awareness that I was turning my back to the door, which was the central problem of the entire situation that was about to unfold. You like him, she said. Gwen, I have rules, I answered, with the steady patience of someone who has had this conversation before and will keep having it. Your rules don't stop feelings, they stop action, I said, which is what matters. But you think about it. Everyone thinks about things. About your boss? She asked, and there was something in the question I needed to shut down immediately. In hypothetical situations, I said, lowering my voice on reflex, even though I was alone in the office. What situations? Gwen said, and it wasn't a question, it was a trap. Gwen, what situations, Briella? Irrelevant ones, I said, finally grabbing the charger, hypothetical and irrelevant. Name one, she said. There was a 2-second silence. 2 seconds in which I, for some reason I'm still trying to understand rationally, decided it was safe to answer. My dream is to see him without his pants, I said. Pause. Briella, Gwen started. It's purely aesthetic, I said quickly, because speed sometimes works as an argument. He wears a suit every day. Dress pants. You don't ever wonder what's... Briella. What? Turn around, she said, and I spun my chair. Niccolo Angelis was standing in the doorway of his own office, which I had left open because I was alone on the floor, phone in hand, tie slightly loosened, with the exact expression of a man who has just heard something he is going to use for the rest of his life. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds, and I counted them, because counting things is what I do when my brain is trying to process too much information at once. He had heard, not part of it, not a fragment. He had heard everything, from the consequence-free smile to the part about the pants, and the expression on his face wasn't shock, which would have been manageable. It was the expression of someone carefully filing the moment away, storing every detail in exactly the right place, and that was so much worse. Gwen, I'll call you back, I said, hanging up without waiting for a response. Niccolo didn't say anything right away. He walked into the office with that unsettling ease of someone in familiar territory with no reason to rush, went to his own desk, sat down, and opened his laptop with the same motion as any other Tuesday at 6:43 p.m. You can go ahead and finish the report, he said, looking at the screen. I started. I know what you were, he answered, in his usual low, even voice. I tried again. I know what it was. Niccolo. I said his name in a tone that was technically professional. Briella. He lifted his eyes from the screen, and there was something in them I couldn't immediately catalog, because in 2 years I had learned almost every version of his gaze, but this one was new. You can work. I stood still for 3 seconds, which was enough time to realize that standing still was worse than anything else, and then I turned around, went to my computer, opened the report, and stared at the screen without processing a single single word for longer than I'm willing to confirm. The silence in the office had a different texture now. It was the kind of silence that knows something, purely aesthetic. His voice came low from across the room, carrying the quality of someone testing the weight of a phrase before deciding to use it again. "Shut up, Angelus," I said, without taking my eyes off the report. "Just confirming I understood the motivation," he replied. "You didn't understand anything. I understood enough," he said. Aesthetic. I closed my laptop, grabbed my bag, walked to the door with the posture of someone who knows exactly what they're doing, and stopped before leaving because something in me needed to make one thing clear. "This doesn't change anything," I said to the hallway without turning around. "I didn't say it does," he replied. "Good, but it could." His voice came with a quality I hadn't heard from him before, lower, more direct, without the irony that was his usual shield. "If you wanted it to." I left without answering. In the elevator, I leaned against the mirrored wall and stared at the ceiling for the entire ride down to the lobby, which was enough time to replay his sentence 6 times and realize that none of those 6 times made it any easier to ignore. "Purely aesthetic," I had said, out loud, with him standing in the doorway. The phone buzzed before I even reached the sidewalk. It was Gwen. Of course it was Gwen. "Briella Osborne, you hung up on me," she said, and I could hear her smiling while she yelled, which was very on brand for her. "He was there," I said. "I know he was there. I heard the silence," she replied. "What did he say?" I was quiet for a long moment, standing on the sidewalk with the wind in my loose hair, and the city making the noise New York makes when it's not paying attention to your personal crisis. "He said it could change," I finally said, "if I wanted it to." Gwen's silence lasted longer than mine. "Briella," she said, and there was a softness in her tone she only used when she thought I was close to doing something irreversible. "No," I said, before she could go on. "I didn't say anything. You were thinking it." "I was thinking that you have a file on your computer called Things I Will Never Do," she said, "and that item number 1 is going to have to work really hard this week." "How do you know about the file?" I asked, because that was the part that mattered. "You showed me when you were drunk 2 years ago," she answered, with the patience of someone who keeps information well. "Damn," I said. "Item number 1. Briella, I know. You going to be okay?" I stood on the sidewalk for another moment, staring at nothing in particular, feeling the weight of that question in a way I hadn't before. "Yeah," I said, but this time it sounded less convincing than usual, and we both knew it. Wednesday, 8:58 a.m. I walked into the office with his coffee. No sugar, right temperature, exactly the way I had known for 2 years without ever realizing I knew, and set it on the desk with the usual efficiency. He didn't look up from the documents. "Good morning, Briella," he said. "Good morning," I replied. "Sleep well?" "Yes," I said, in the voice of someone who slept enough to function and is not going into details. "No inconvenient dreams?" he asked, and I felt his smile before I saw it, because I had learned to feel that specific smile in the shift of the air around it when it appeared. I stopped in the doorway. "You have a 9 o'clock meeting I'm reminding you about," I said. "Noted," he replied. "Aesthetic." I closed the office door with more force than necessary. On the other side, Niccolo smiled at the document, not the calculated smirk, not the executive-grade irony, something more genuine, deeper, the kind he hadn't known he still had until that Tuesday at 6:43 p.m. when the office was empty, or so she thought. Chapter 2. He says she can look whenever she wants. 3 days. For 3 days, Niccolo Angelus used the word aesthetic as if it were part of his standard work vocabulary. Always low, always timed for when I had my back turned or was looking the other way, always with that neutrality of a man who's making a joke but not quite. It was surgical. It was exactly the kind of thing you couldn't log as harassment and couldn't brush off as teasing, and I had the feeling he knew that with perfect precision. My response was efficiency. The more he pushed, the more I delivered. Flawless reports, seamless meetings, calendar management with no room for questions. It was the only armor I had inside that office, and I used every bit of it. If he wanted to throw me off, I was going to show him that thrown off. I still outperformed most people at their sharpest. Doriano watched all of it with the expression of a man watching a train heading straight for a collision who has decided it's not his place to jump in front of it. Doriano Mancini was Niccolo's right hand, the kind of constant presence you learn to read before you learn the name, loyal with the solidity of someone who made that choice once and never revisited it. It had taken me a few weeks to understand his real role in the office, and a few more months to understand the real role of the office itself. The pieces had come together gradually, the meetings that stopped when I walked in, the men who showed up without appointments, the conversations in Italian that Niccolo never translated, and I never asked about. I wasn't sure of the exact moment I knew. I just knew that one day I woke up knowing, and that the rules I had set for myself suddenly made even more sense than when I wrote them. On Friday, as the floor was emptying and the hallway light had that amber quality of end of day, Niccolo came out of the last meeting with his jacket over his arm. It was a gesture I had cataloged without realizing I was cataloging it, the way he draped the jacket jacket over his forearm, unbuttoned the top button of his collar, and loosened his tie knot with 2 fingers, all in one motion, as if the entire day had been an act of restraint and that was the signal it was over. The thing was, I had never seen him do it in a meeting, with a client, with the family, at an event, only here, only when it was just the 2 of us. Doriano had told me that once, in a conversation I pretended not to be paying close enough attention to. He doesn't loosen his tie anywhere else, Briella. And I had said it was irrelevant in the tone of someone who believed that, and Doriano had agreed in the tone of someone who doesn't believe anything. I was at my desk when Nicolo stopped in front of it. Jacket over his arm, tie loosened, looking at me with that attention I had learned to recognize as dangerous, because it wasn't the attention of an executive assessing an employee. It was something else. It was the attention of someone who looks because they want to, not because they have to. "You can look whenever you want," he said. The office went quiet in a way that felt physical, as if the air itself had decided to stop. Doriano, who had been pretending to work in the corner of the room, stopped pretending. I raised my eyes slowly, with the kind of control you develop when your entire body wants to do something else. He was standing in front of my desk as if he had said something logistical, as if he had mentioned Monday's meeting or the overdue report, and not as if he had just offered what he had offered in response to a sentence I had said 3 days ago in a private conversation with my best friend. The conversation that followed was short, fast, and useless on my end, because he had an answer for everything I said, and the answers were technically correct enough to leave me without a comeback. My office. An offer, not harassment. You said it out loud. All true. All infuriating precisely because of that. Doriano left the office at a speed that wasn't like him, picking up documents as if they were urgent, heading into the hallway with the discretion of someone who has already figured out that the best thing he can do is cease to exist for the next 10 minutes. And then, when it was just the 2 of us, and the silence between us had the quality of something waiting to be named, Nicolo said the sentence I hadn't expected, not the joke, not the provocation, the layer underneath all of it. "I spent 2 years being professional when I didn't have to be quite that professional," he said, his voice lower than usual, with none of the humor he used as a shield. I held his gaze for longer than I should have. There was something different in his tone. It was honest in a way he rarely was, the kind of honesty that surfaces when someone drops their guard for a second without planning to, and you see what's underneath before they can cover it back up. And what was underneath was someone who had stayed on this side of a line for 2 years by choice, not for lack of wanting to cross it. I didn't know what to do with that. With the irritation I felt, with the embarrassment still burning in my cheeks, with that thing that was neither one nor the other, and was getting harder to ignore. So I did the only thing my body decided to do before I could veto it. I stepped toward him and pressed my palm flat against his chest. It wasn't hard. It was the kind of hit that has no intention of hurting. It had the intention of doing something with my hand that wasn't just standing there. The problem was the fraction of a second after, when my hand didn't immediately pull back. When it stayed there, over his suit, over the warmth coming through the fabric, over something my brain registered before I could block the registration. He was solid in a way that was unnecessary information I now possessed forever. I looked at my own hand, as if it had acted without authorization, because that was exactly what had happened. He looked at my hand, then at me, with that smile that was the original problem in all of this. "Aesthetic?" he said, quietly. I pulled my hand back, grabbed my bag, walked to the door with the posture of someone who has a destination and a purpose, and not of someone who is fleeing from her own traitorous hand. In the hallway, Doriano was leaning against the wall with the document still in his hand, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who heard everything and has decided he is happy about it for reasons that will not be discussed. That night, lying on my back in my apartment staring at the ceiling with my phone on my chest, I did what I always do when something gets too big to hold alone. I called Gwen. I told her everything. The offer, the line about the 2 years, the hand on his chest, the information I hadn't asked for about just how solid he was. Gwen listened to all of it without interrupting, which was rare for her, and meant she was processing seriously. "He said he spent 2 years being professional when he didn't have to be quite that professional," she repeated slowly, as if she were weighing every word. "That's what he said," I confirmed. "Briella," she said my name with that specific softness. "That's not a joke. That's a confession." I knew it was a confession. That was exactly the problem. Jokes I knew how to manage, knew how to deflect, knew how to keep in the right box where things that went nowhere were stored. But a confession was different. A confession had weight, had history, had 2 years of cataloged tension packed inside it, and I didn't have a box the right size to hold it. "He's my boss," I said, because sometimes you need to say the obvious out loud for it to keep being obvious. "He's the boss of the Italian mob in New York," Gwen corrected, "which is different and more complicated in every possible direction." "Thanks, that was helpful." "And you hit him in the chest and kept your hand there for 2 seconds, she went on. "It was a reflex." "Briella," her voice went serious in a way I didn't like. "You have a problem." "I know," I said. "You've had it for a while," she replied. "The difference is that now he knows too." I went quiet, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, feeling the weight of that settle harder than I wanted to admit, because it was true. I could keep item number 1 in the file untouched, could keep delivering flawless reports and managing the calendar efficiently, and meeting every joke with the composed cool of someone who was not being affected. But something had shifted in the texture of the space between us, and I knew, with the same clear-eyed certainty with which I knew everything I had ever learned, that space that changes texture doesn't go back to what it was before. Monday, 8:58 a.m. I walked in with the coffee, set it on the desk, went to my chair with the determination of someone who has a lot of work and zero mental bandwidth for anything else. He looked up from the documents. "Good morning." "Good morning," I replied. "You hit me on Friday," he said, in the voice of someone picking up an agenda item. "It was an accident," I said. "Open palm. Reflex. You kept it there for 2 seconds," he said. I walked into my office without answering. Posture straight. Stride steady, certain I was not going to turn around. Behind me, I heard his voice. Low, just one word, just that one. Aesthetic. The door closed. On the other side, Niccolo looked at the door for a moment, then picked up his phone and texted Doriano with the objectivity of a man who has reached a conclusion. "She'll come around." Doriano replied in 10 seconds. "I've known for a year." Chapter 3. Between jokes and something that isn't a joke. 2 weeks after the Friday of the chest, the office had a different texture. Nothing I could point to in a report or note in the minutes. It was something smaller and larger at the same time. The way the silence between us had changed quality, as if it had learned to carry something it hadn't carried before. Niccolo kept making jokes. I kept responding with competence. But there was a new layer to every interaction, a mutual awareness that made even the simplest moments different from what they used to be. I had started noticing things that had always been there, but now had weight. The way he listened when I spoke. For instance, not with half the attention of a busy executive, but with his full attention, the kind you feel on your skin before you see it in someone's eyes. When I presented analysis in a meeting, he didn't interrupt, didn't anticipate, didn't check his phone mid-sentence. He just stayed still, watching me, with that focus that was unsettling in its completeness, because it wasn't what I expected from a man accustomed to being the center of every room he walked into. And there was the tie, always loosened when it was just the two of us, always in place when someone else was around, as if he had an internal switch that only I ever saw him flip. Doriano had told me that once, in a conversation I pretended not to be paying close enough attention to. He doesn't loosen his tie anywhere else, Briella. Not in meetings, not with clients, not with the family. I had said it was irrelevant in the tone of someone who believed that. Doriano had agreed in the tone of someone who doesn't believe anything. I had tried to catalog all of it as neutral data. It wasn't working. The business dinner was on a Thursday evening. At a restaurant in Midtown I knew by name and by calendar, but had never actually been inside. 6 men from the allied family in Rome. Niccolo at the head of the table. Me beside him with a tablet and the posture of an assistant. Clear function, minimal visibility, necessary presence. The usual arrangement. What I hadn't accounted for was the introduction. Niccolo waited through the initial greetings, waited for the wine to be poured, and then turned slightly in my direction, before looking at the men from Rome and saying, with the straightforward ease of someone passing along logistical information, "Briella Osborne, the most indispensable person in this company." 6 pairs of eyes turned to me at once. I raised my eyes from the tablet with the composure of someone who has practiced composure, and carried the conversation that followed with the usual efficiency. But something inside me was making a low sound I needed to process away from that table, because Doriano had told me once, in that tone of someone who has been observing for a long time, that Niccolo didn't give compliments in public, ever. That it was a principle, not a habit. A choice made by a man who understood that a public compliment was information, and that information in his world had a cost. 4 minutes in the restaurant bathroom. I stood at the sink looking at my own reflection with the water still running over my fingers and tried to be reasonable. He had introduced me. It was procedure, strategy, perception management. The face looking back at me from the mirror didn't seem convinced. When I came back to the dinner, Niccolo was mid-sentence about the logistics of the deal, but I noticed, because I had learned to notice, that he had paused the conversation 1 second before I appeared in the doorway, as if he had been waiting, and only resumed when I walked in. Nobody else at the table would have caught it. I caught it because I catch everything that involves him, and that was a problem I was cataloging without solving. In the car on the way back, Doriano drove in silence, and the city moved past the window with that characteristic New York indifference to other people's crises. Niccolo and I were in the back seat with a distance between us that was technically appropriate, and that I was feeling in every inch. "You didn't have to introduce me like that," I said, looking out the window. because it was easier to talk to the city than to turn and face his expression. There was a short pause before he answered. "It was true," he said, with the simplicity of someone who sees nothing to argue about, as if the most indispensable person in this company were objective data and not the thing I had been processing for the past hour. I turned slightly toward him, just enough to see his profile against the window on the other side. The firm jaw, the tie knot still in place because there were others in the car, that restraint he carried in his body like a second skin. And still, even with all his composure intact, there was something in the way he held himself that I recognized as someone waiting to hear what I would say next. "You said you spent 2 years being professional when you didn't have to be quite that professional," I said, quieter, without taking my eyes off his profile. Was that true too? The pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. In the front seat, Doriano didn't move, but I would have bet he had stopped breathing. "Yes," Niccolo said. One word, the weight of an entire world inside it. I turned back to the window, and the space between our shoulders felt smaller than the actual distance, as if the physical gap had stopped being the kind of distance that matters, replaced by something else that had no name, but that I felt with the same precision. "I have rules," I said, "because sometimes you need to say the obvious out loud for it to keep being obvious." "I know," he replied, and his voice came out quieter now, aimed forward, but with that quality of something being said directly to me regardless of direction. "I'm not asking you to break anything. I'm being honest about what exists. What you do with that is yours." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a long time, and that was exactly what made it complicated. I didn't know what to do with honesty that asked for nothing in return, that simply placed itself in the space between us and stayed there, waiting. "You're complicated," I said. "You're more so," he replied, and there was something in his tone that wasn't criticism. It was the observation of someone who finds the complication interesting rather than inconvenient, who finds it interesting, and who is no longer trying to hide that quite as carefully as before. The car stopped in front of my building. I got out, stopped on the sidewalk, and turned around because something made me turn. He was watching me through the window. Not the office smile, not the calculated smirk. Something else. The face of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the world around him to catch up to it. I went inside without saying anything else, and thought, riding the elevator up, that the problem with Niccolo Angelis wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say, and how the unsaid took up more space than any words ever would. On Friday, I was leaving later than usual when my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered out of habit, and the silence on the other end lasted half a second before the voice came through. "Briella Osborne?" he said. "Who's this?" I asked, stopping in the middle of the hallway. "Marco Sev," he answered. The hallway went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the actual noise level. Marco, 3 years without hearing that name, and it was arriving through the phone on a Friday evening as if it were nothing. Marco Sev had been the person who taught me, at 22, that caring about someone was no guarantee they would stay when things got hard. The relationship had been real. I never denied that. But when the weight of everyday life grew heavier than what existed between us, he left. No fight, no scene, with that gentleness of a man who knows how to say goodbye in a way that almost seems kind, until you realize he's gone. I had stayed, learned what I learned, and built the rules I built on the foundation of exactly that. 3 years of silence, and now he was in New York. The conversation was short. He said he was in the city, that he wanted to talk, that it wasn't about anything specific, and that old ease was still there, unhurried, calibrated. I wished him a good night and hung up before he finished his next sentence, and stood in the hallway with my phone in my hand, and an expression I hadn't controlled in time. That was exactly the moment Niccolo walked out of his office and saw me. He stopped, looked at me with that attention that read what I wasn't saying before what I was, and went quiet for a full second, the kind of silence that belongs to someone processing and deciding at the same time. Then he asked what had happened, in his usual low voice, and I said it was nothing, too quickly to be convincing. He didn't push. But the way he watched me as I walked to the elevator had the quality of someone who doesn't ask, because he'll find out either way, and who is giving space right now by choice, not for lack of interest. The elevator closed. I leaned against the mirrored wall and looked at the ceiling. Marco Sev was in New York, and Niccolo Angelis had read my face before I could hide what was written on it. Both facts together had a weight I needed to stop ignoring, and that, for now, I still wasn't ready to face. Chapter 4. The Past Has a New Number. Marco Sev had called 4 times in 3 days. I had answered the second call because ignoring indefinitely was the kind of strategy that creates a bigger problem than it solves, and because Marco was the persistent type, not out of love, but out of habit. He kept going until someone gave in. I had decided that giving in once, firmly enough, would be more efficient than continuing to dodge. It wasn't as efficient as I had planned. His voice still had that particular softness. No urgency, no pressure. The kind of tone that felt safe until you remembered that safe and reliable weren't the same thing. He asked for coffee. 1 hour. No commitment. No agenda, just a conversation. I I said no on the second call, no on the third, and on the fourth I said 1 coffee, 1 hour, and then you disappear, with the firmness of someone closing something, not opening it. The problem was, I needed to believe that while I was saying it. The following Monday at 9:05 a.m., I walked into the office with my tablet and the day's agenda, and without Nicolo's coffee. I only realized when he looked at the empty desk with that minimal pause of someone who noticed, but is deciding whether to say anything. 2 years of routine, and it was the first time I had forgotten. He knew that. I knew he knew. And the fact that neither of us said a word made the lapse more present than any comment would have been. I went to the break room to get it without saying anything, and he came with me, which was new enough to make me take note. We arrived together, I picked up the cup, and he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and that way of looking that wasn't professional assessment. It was more direct than that, more personal, the kind of attention that warms your skin before you understand where the warmth is coming from. "You've been different since Friday," he said, in his usual low voice, as if he were commenting on the weather outside. I kept stirring the coffee without looking at him, because looking at him in the small break room at that hour of the morning felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. "I'm the same," I replied. "You're not," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made me stop for half a second before going on. No question mark. No pressure, just the quiet certainty of a man who has already formed an opinion and doesn't need it confirmed. He wasn't asking if I was okay. He was telling me he saw it, that nothing I tried to hide would go unnoticed. That was simultaneously reassuring and absolutely devastating for my composure. I told him enough, said something from the past had resurfaced, that I was handling it, that I didn't need help. He held my gaze for a second after I finished, and the distance between us in the small break room was less than a meter, and I could feel his presence with that solidity I had already cataloged involuntarily on the Friday of the chest, and hadn't been able to uncatalog since. "If you need anything," he said finally, leaving the sentence open as an invitation, not a condition. "I won't," I replied, "but thank you." I took the coffee and left. He stayed in the break room a little longer, and I didn't turn around to see the expression on his face, because there were moments when it was safer not to know. The coffee with Marco was on Tuesday, 1 hour, at a neutral cafe in Midtown that held no memory for either of us, a deliberate choice on my part, because neutral settings produced more objective conversations. He arrived with his usual easy smile, with that attention that seemed total and that I had spent too long believing was. He said I looked different, that 3 years had changed me for the better, and I listened to all of it with the patience of someone waiting to get to the part that matters. When it came, he said he had been wrong, that when things got complicated, he should have stayed, that he regretted it, that he wanted me to know. The sentence came out with the same softness as always, carefully constructed, the kind that sounds like a confession but functions like a strategy. I looked at my coffee for a moment before answering, weighing what I wanted to say against what was true, and decided the two things were the same this time. "That doesn't change anything," I said, in the calm voice of someone who reached that conclusion before the conversation even started. Marco went quiet for a second, and I saw in him that subtle surprise of a man who isn't used to hearing no said with such steadiness. Then he tried a different angle, said there was something different about me, something he couldn't name but could see, and that he wanted to understand where it came from. I realized, listening to him say that the difference he was seeing had nothing to do with him. It had to do with Nicolo Angelis and 2 years of loosened ties and coffee at the right temperature, an undivided attention that I had tried to catalog as neutral data and never managed to. "There's someone," Marco said, and it wasn't a question. It was the observation of a man who had learned to read what wasn't being said. I didn't answer, and the silence was answer enough. I left at exactly the 1 hour mark. But I thought more than I had planned to, and not about the reasons Marco wanted. That night, Doriano walked into Nicolo's office with the expression of someone who has information and is calculating how to deliver it. I learned this the next day, not because anyone told me, but because Nicolo arrived on Wednesday with that sharper than usual attention, the look of a man who had spent the night adding data to a calculation he hadn't yet finished. He said nothing about Marco. I said nothing about Marco, and the unsaid sat between us with the presence of something that exists, whether or not it's named. On Thursday, I came back from an off-site meeting later than expected, and stepped off the elevator to find him in the hallway, hands in his pockets, with the posture of someone who had been there before I arrived, and was not there by accident. He looked me over with that attention that didn't apologize for existing, and there was something in his gaze that I had learned to recognize as dangerous. Not dangerous like a threat, dangerous like something that unsettles you without asking permission. "Marco called again," I said, before he could ask, because honesty was easier than trying to hide something from someone who read my face better than I would have liked. I scheduled a dinner for next week, to close it out for good. The silence that followed was brief, but it was the kind of silence that has weight. "Dinner," he repeated, in the neutral voice of someone processing information, and the neutrality was technical, constructed, because there was something underneath it that wasn't neutral at all. "It's the most efficient format for a longer conversation," I said. "Or the most dangerous one," he replied, low. I stood in the hallway looking at him, and between us was that familiar tension that lately had a different quality, denser, more charged, the kind you feel in your throat before you feel it anywhere else. He was less than a foot away from me, and I could see the line of his jaw, the tie in place because we were in the hallway, the way he breathed with that restraint of a man holding back more than he was letting show. There was a moment there. The kind of moment that exists when the distance between two bodies is small enough to be a choice rather than a coincidence. I felt it, and he felt it. I knew he felt it, because I saw it in the way his eyes dropped for a second to my face before coming back up. And still he didn't cross that space. I understood, with the kind of clarity that shows up at the wrong times, that he wasn't going to cross it while there was anything unresolved hanging between us. Because Niccolo Angelis was the kind of man who doesn't begin something in the middle of something else, who waits for the board to be clean before writing on it. It was infuriating. It was completely consistent with everything I knew about him, and it was costing me more than I wanted to admit. Some doors you close for good reasons should stay closed, he said finally, in the voice of someone saying something with more than one layer. What if the reason isn't that good anymore? I heard my own voice before I decided I was going to answer. He held my gaze for too long to be casual, and too briefly to be everything that look wanted to say. Depends on which door you want to open, he replied, and his voice came out with that low quality he used when he was being more honest than he had planned to be. And for whom? He went into his office. I stood in the hallway looking at the closed door, with my heart making that sound I had stopped pretending I couldn't hear, and the growing certainty that dinner with Marco was the least of my problems. Chapter 5. The dinner that shouldn't have been a dinner. The dinner with Marco had started exactly the way I planned, neutral, direct, the kind of conversation that exists to close a chapter, not open a new one. He arrived before me, and was already seated when I walked in, with that relaxed air of a man who never seems to be in a hurry about anything. He brought flowers, white roses, wrapped in craft paper, set on top of the table, as if that were something you did at a closing dinner. I moved them to the corner without comment, and he laughed in that way I recognized. The laugh of someone who finds other people's resistance amusing. "You're going to kill me with that look," he said. "You brought flowers to a closing dinner," I replied, opening the menu. "It's not a closing dinner for me," he said, and his voice had that same old softness, that tone that never rose, never pushed, that simply hung in the air, waiting for you to give in. I didn't give in. The conversation was direct, the way I wanted it to be. He said he had been wrong, that when things got hard he should have stayed, that he was in New York for a work project, but that reaching out to me was a choice, not a coincidence. I listened to all of it with the patience of someone who has rehearsed the answer, and when my turn came, I said, in the calm voice of someone who is certain, "There's nothing to rebuild, Marco. You left when it got hard. That tells me everything I need to know about what we had." He went quiet for a moment. Then he said there was something different about me, something he couldn't name, and I knew, hearing him say that the difference he was seeing had nothing to do with him. I didn't answer, and the silence between us was answer enough. "There's someone," he said, more to himself than to me. I didn't confirm it, but I didn't deny it either, and we both knew what that meant. The conversation had ended well, or so it seemed, until the moment it didn't. We left the table heading toward the restaurant's lobby, and that was where a man who had been in the same room, someone from Marco's business circle, drunk enough to have lost all sense of limits, recognized me from a previous work situation, and started making comments that crossed a line with the ease of someone who is used to never being interrupted. Marco stepped in front of me before I could react, and for a second I thought he was going to handle it, but it quickly became clear that he had moved out of ego, not out of concern for me, and the situation escalated the way situations with drunk men and inflated pride tend to escalate. I stepped back, scanned the room for an exit, and turned to find a clear path. I bumped into someone. I turned. Niccolo Angelis was standing a meter away from me, in a dark suit, with Doriano 2 steps behind him, and the expression on his face was that of a man who had assessed the entire situation in under 3 seconds, and had already decided how it was going to end. He wasn't surprised to see me there. I was surprised to see him, but some part of me, the part I pretended didn't exist, wasn't. His gaze moved to me first, quick and complete, as if he were checking that I was in one piece. Then it went to the drunk man, then to Marco. And there, in that lit lobby with that background music that had nothing to do with anything that was happening, I watched Niccolo Angelis do absolutely nothing, and do it in a way that was more effective than anything I had ever seen. He stood still, eyes on the drunk man, with that presence that needed no volume, no gesture. It was the kind of silence that people in his world recognized as a final warning. The man recalculated, stepped back, left. Marco looked at Niccolo, and Niccolo looked at Marco, and between them there was that silent assessment of men who understand power and are measuring each other's without saying a word. It was brief. It was enough. "Good night," I said to both of them, to neither of them specifically, and I left. In the Uber, with the city moving past the window, and my heart still beating faster than I wanted to admit, I brought my hand to my ear out of reflex. The ear was bare. I ran my fingers slowly over the lobe, looking for what wasn't there, and understood before I even confirmed it that the earring had disappeared somewhere in the chaos of the lobby. The small earring, plain gold, that had been my mother's, that I wore not because it matched anything, but because it was hers, and because some things you carry on your body because you don't know how to carry them any other way. I kept my hand on the empty ear for the rest of the ride. I didn't cry over Marco. I didn't cry over the dinner. I cried over the earring I had lost in the middle of a situation I had created myself, trying to close something that was already closed, and there was something about that specific irony that hurt in a way I didn't have words for. On Friday morning, I arrived at the office with slightly swollen eyes from not sleeping well, and Niccolo noticed before I even reached my desk. He was in the break room when I walked in, which was unusual, because Niccolo was rarely in the break room in the morning. There were 2 coffees already prepared on the counter, and he was standing beside them with his hands in his pockets, looking at me in a way that had nothing casual about it. "You made my coffee," I said, stopping in the doorway. "You look tired," he replied, simply, as if that explained everything and nothing more needed to be said. I looked at him for a second, trying to find the professional angle in that, and couldn't find one. He had come in early, made 2 coffees, and was waiting, not dramatically, not with a prepared speech. He was just there, present, the way he was when he stopped being the Don long enough to be something else. Then he reached into his pocket and set something on the counter. Small, gold, my earring. He placed it beside the coffee without ceremony, without turning it into a bigger moment than it was, but we both knew it was bigger than it looked, and the silence between us carried that weight carefully. "Doriana went to get it," he said, "at the restaurant, last night." I looked at the earring for 3 seconds before picking it up. I closed my hand around it and felt that minimal weight of something small that means a great deal, and I had to breathe deeply before I could speak. "Thank you," I said, in a voice that came out quieter than I planned. He nodded, and then, instead of going back to his office, he stayed in the break room, close enough for me to feel the warmth of him, far enough to be technically an acceptable distance, exactly on that line he held with a precision I had given up calling coincidence. I raised my eyes to him because there was no longer any way not to. He was looking at me in a way that was different from every other way I had cataloged over the past 2 years. Not the sarcasm, not the executive attention, not the calculated smirk. Something more direct, more open. The expression of a man who had decided he was going to stop guarding so much with so much care. The space between us in the small break room had the quality of something waiting, the air heavier, the distance measured in breath and not in meters, and I was completely aware of every point of my body that was oriented toward him. "The dinner," he said, in his usual low voice, but with a new layer underneath. "How did it go?" "It's done," I said, and there was more in those 2 words than the answer about dinner with Marco. He understood. I saw that he understood by the way his eyes changed. Something settling, something rearranging, like pieces finally falling into the right place after too long out of it. He raised his hand slowly and ran the tips of his fingers along my cheek. Light, barely any pressure, the kind of touch that asks before it asserts, and I went completely still, with the earring closed in my fist, and my heart forgetting the rhythm it had before. "Briella." He said my name as if it were the only word that mattered in that moment. And then his phone rang. He closed his eyes for half a second, just half a second, but I saw it. Before pulling the phone from his pocket, he looked at the screen. His expression shifted, not to coldness, but to that specific focus that meant his world had remembered it existed. "I have to take this," he said, in the voice of someone apologizing for something bigger than a phone call. "Go," I said. He left, and I stood in the break room with the coffee, with the earring closed in my hand, and with the sensation of his fingertips on my cheek that I knew I was going to keep feeling for far longer than I wanted to admit. I put the earring on, and I understood, in that moment, that something had been admitted, not out loud, not in words, but in the way that important things tend to be admitted first, quietly, from the inside, with no way to undo it. Chapter 6. What she admits, and what he does with it. It was 2 in the morning when I opened the file. I hadn't planned to open it. I had planned to sleep, had planned to stop thinking about the break room, the earring, the tips of his fingers on my cheek, and the half second of closed eyes before he answered the phone. But sleep didn't come, and the ceiling of my bedroom had no answers for anything, and so I opened the laptop almost on reflex, and the file was there, the way it always was. Things I will never do. Item number 1, black font, firm, the way I had written it 2 years ago, the night I realized that working near Niccolo Angelis without a clear rule would be the kind of mistake you don't undo. I had written it with the certainty of someone who knows her own limits. I had kept it with the discipline of someone who knows that limits exist for a reason. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Then, without drama, without an internal speech, I selected the text and changed the font color to gray. I didn't delete it. I wasn't ready to delete it. But gray wasn't black. Gray was me admitting, at 2 in the morning, that the rule was under review, that 3 seconds of a touch in the break room had done something I could no longer pretend it hadn't done, that my mother's earring, returned in silence without my ever having asked, had weighed in a way no calculated gesture ever would. I closed the laptop, sat in the dark. Item number 1, gray font. It was a small move. It was the biggest one I had made in 2 years. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Gwen. You sent me a photo of the file at 2 a.m. Explain. I looked at my phone for a moment. I had sent a photo at 2 a.m. Apparently my subconscious needed a witness. I changed the font on item number 1 to gray, I wrote. The reply came in 10 seconds. Briella, gray isn't deleting, but this is movement. This is you saying the rule is cracking. It's a different color, I replied, because sometimes the denial needs to be logged even when no one believes it. It's you admitting you like him, she wrote. You have for a while. You just stopped pretending you don't. I set the phone on the table and looked out the apartment window at the morning light coming through the glass. Gwen wasn't wrong. Gwen was almost never wrong about the things I didn't want to hear, which was a quality of hers that I loved and resented in equal measure. I liked him. I had for a while, and my mother's earring had been the drop that turned the font gray. Niccolo said nothing on Monday or Tuesday, but he had changed in a way I felt before I could name. A series of small things that meant nothing on their own and everything together. The door to his office, which by default stayed closed when he was working, started staying open when I was at my desk. Not wide open. Not obviously, just ajar enough for there to be a connection between the two spaces, as if he had decided, without announcing it, that he no longer wanted the physical separation the door represented. He started including me in meetings that had previously been just him and Doriano, not as an assistant, not to take minutes, but as a participant, with my opinion solicited and heard. In a meeting on Wednesday, he turned to me in front of 3 other men, and asked what I thought of the deal with the Ferreira family, and everyone in the room looked at me at once, and I gave the analysis I would have given if I had been consulted from the start, with 2 angles no one had raised before. When the meeting ended and the men were filing out, Niccolo stayed standing beside me while I put away my tablet. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, close enough that I felt the sleeve of his suit brush lightly against my arm, that minimal contact with the quality of something intentional disguised as accident. The analysis was right, he said, in the low voice he used when he was speaking only to me, even with other people still leaving the room. I know, I replied, because it was true, and because he knew I knew. The corner of his mouth appeared, that one, the one that had been a problem from the start. I know you know, he said. I just wanted to hear you say it. And he walked back to his desk, with the ease of a man who has just said something completely destabilizing and doesn't seem the least bit sorry about it. Doriano found me in the hallway after the meeting with the expression of someone who has an observation to make and is going to make it whether invited or not. That's never happened before, he said, walking beside me. What exactly? I asked, because I wanted to hear him say it. Him asking for an opinion in an operational meeting. Doriano replied, in that tone of someone passing along strategic information while refusing to call it by name. Never. In 2 years, I've never seen him do that with anyone. I kept walking without answering, and Doriano kept pace beside me. And in that silence, there was the quiet understanding of 2 people who know the same thing and are pretending they don't. On Friday, everyone left early, and the floor settled into that particular stillness of a weekend arriving. I was finishing a report, he was reviewing a contract, and the silence between us had that new quality, dense, charged, the kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of something unsaid. I heard his chair move, heard his footsteps, and then he was standing in front of my desk, and I raised my eyes slowly, because raising my eyes to him at that hour of the day, with the floor empty and the light low, was the kind of thing that needed to be done carefully. He had loosened his tie. Of course he had. Why did you go to the restaurant that night? I asked, before I could talk myself out of asking. He stood still, looking down at me with that expression that was hard to hold when he was this close. Tie loosened, top button of his collar open, jacket on the back of his chair. That version of him that only appeared when it was just the 2 of us, which I had catalogued as private without anyone having declared it so. Doriano told me where you were going, he answered, directly. No detour. And you went, I said. I did. Why? The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was a choice. Him choosing which version of the truth to give me, and me waiting with the patience of someone who has learned that his pauses carry weight. Because I didn't like the idea of you being alone at dinner with someone from your past, he said finally. And because I didn't like not liking it, which is more inconvenient than the first problem. His honesty caught me off guard, the way it always did. That was what he did. He opened up space with that quiet directness. No drama, no detour, and left me to decide what to do with what was in it. I stood up from my chair slowly. We ended up standing face to face with the desk no longer between us, and the remaining distance was less than half a meter, and I could see the pulse in his throat, the line of his jaw, his dark eyes fixed on me with that attention that never apologized for existing. His hand moved first. It rose slowly up my arm, palm warm through the thin fabric of my sleeve, and stopped at my shoulder with a light pressure that was equal parts restraint and promise. You're jealous, I said quietly. I don't use that word, he replied, just as quietly, and his voice came out with a roughness it didn't have when other people were around. "It's the right word, maybe," he admitted, and his eyes dropped for a second to my face, my neck before coming back to me, and that second lasted longer than a second should. His hand left my shoulder with that deliberate slowness of something that didn't want to go but went anyway, and I felt the absence before the contact even ended. "Item number 1, I said, barely above a whisper. He went still. "What was that?" he asked, in the voice of someone who understood but wants to hear it from me. "I have a file," I said, looking at him, "of things I will never do. Item number 1 is not getting involved with my boss." He didn't move. "The font has been gray for 3 days, I said. "I didn't delete it, but it's gray." The silence that followed had the texture of something changing shape as it existed. I saw in his face something settle, not relief, not victory, something deeper, more personal, the kind that appears when you receive something you waited for long enough to have stopped being certain it would ever come. I went back to my chair, picked up my bag, left before either of us could complicate what was simple for now. Behind me, I heard his breathing change for a second. Just a second, but I heard it. On Sunday, a message from Doriano came through on the number I had for work reasons. "There's something I need to tell you about Niccolo. There's a woman, Valentina Greco. She's coming back to New York." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I opened the laptop, opened the file, stared at item number 1 with the gray font, and my finger hovered over delete for 3 full seconds. I didn't press it, but the gray that had been the gray of hope became the gray of something else, and I still wasn't sure exactly what. Chapter 7. Valentina and what Briella didn't know she felt until she felt it. Valentina Greco had the kind of beauty that money refined but didn't create. She walked into the partners' event on a Tuesday evening like someone who knows the effect she has and decided, a long time ago, to stop pretending she doesn't. Black dress, understated jewelry, hair pinned up with that elegance of something that took too long to look effortless. She was beautiful in a genuine way, and that made her harder to ignore than if it had all been constructed. I saw her first. I stopped for a second in the middle of the room, tablet in hand and assistant function firmly in place, and watched with the kind of objectivity I used when I needed to catalog something painful, without letting it hurt while I was doing the cataloging. Valentina Greco. 2 years in Niccolo's past. The relationship that had ended because their worlds became incompatible. That was what Doriano had told me in his Sunday message, with that economy of words of someone who delivers only the essentials and leaves the rest for the imagination to work with. What my imagination had done with that information over the past 2 days was nothing I wanted to say out loud. Then I saw her see Niccolo. And then, with that painful clarity of someone cataloging data they'd rather not have, I saw how he saw her. There was no affection in his gaze. There was something more complicated than affection. Recognition, history, the specific weight of 2 years of something that doesn't end clean, even when it ends right. Valentina went to him with the ease of someone who knows the way, and the conversation that started between them had the texture of 2 people who have already said everything there is to say and still find things to talk about, because shared history always finds material. I stayed 4 meters away with my tablet and the professional expression I had been constructing with effort for the past 30 seconds. Neutral information, I told myself. Objective data. The font of item number 1 went gray in my memory, and I wasn't sure whether the gray was turning black again. The signal came 20 minutes later. Niccolo and I had a system, built over 2 years of events, dinners and meetings where strategic exits were necessary. When he needed a convincing professional interruption, he would touch my shoulder lightly. One touch. Discreet, his palm resting for half a second before lifting. That was the signal. I would create the interruption. He would exit the conversation, and no one in the room would realize it had been arranged. I felt the touch. His palm landed on my shoulder with that familiar pressure, and I was already turning, already composing the professional line, already in efficient assistant mode, until I processed which conversation he was exiting. Valentina's. He was using the signal to get out of Valentina. I executed flawlessly, as always. I turned to the group, tablet in hand, and said that a representative from one of the partner families had arrived and was requesting 10 minutes before the formal session. Niccolo excused himself with his usual ease, and we walked away together across the room with the naturalness of professional routine. When we were far enough away, I spoke quietly. "There's no representative here." "I know," he replied, just as quietly. "The signal is for when you need a business exit," I said, looking ahead, at the room full of people who weren't paying attention to us. "I needed an exit," he said, "from Valentina." He didn't answer, and the silence was confirmation enough. I took one slow breath before going on. "Why did you need an exit from her?" "Because conversations with her get complicated," he said, in his usual direct voice, no detour. "And I didn't want complicated tonight." "Why not tonight, specifically?" I asked, and there was something in my voice that I hadn't planned to put there. He turned slightly toward me, and I felt his gaze on the side of my face before I could prepare for it. "Because you were here," he said. I stopped walking for half a second. He kept going in the same direction, unhurried, as if he had said something about logistics, and I needed a full moment before my legs remembered how to function again before matching his pace. "Because you were here." He had used the signal, our signal, built over 2 years of work and professionalism, to exit his past because I was in the same room, and he had said it with that direct honesty that was the most unsettling thing about him, because there was no way to pretend I hadn't heard it, no way to catalog it as neutral data, no box the right size to hold it. Valentina found me near the end of the event, with the elegance of someone who makes everything look accidental, including the encounters that aren't. She stood in front of me with her wine glass in hand, and a smile that held more assessment than warmth, and looked at me the way women who understand territory look at other women who have just been identified as a relevant presence. "Briella Osborne," she said, with the familiarity of someone who did her research before arriving. "I've heard about you. Good things, I hope," I replied, in the professional voice I used when I needed to be polite without being accessible. "Interesting things," she said, and there was in her tone that sophistication of a woman who chooses her words the way someone chooses weapons, for effect, not volume. 2 years with him. That's considerable time. I'm efficient, I said. "I'm sure." She took a sip of wine without taking her eyes off me, with the patience of someone who isn't in a hurry because she thinks she's already won. He's efficient too, in everything he does, including with people. It was a warning, wrapped in elegance, but a warning. The kind that says I know him in a way you don't, and you should remember that before you continue with whatever you're continuing. I looked at her for a second, weighing what was in her words, and then replied in the quiet, firm voice that Niccolo had learned to recognize as my signal that patience had reached its limit. "Valentina, I'm not sure what you're trying to say, but if it's what it sounds like, you're wasting perfectly good elegance." The silence that followed was brief, but it was the kind of silence that has a result. She looked at me for a moment with a different expression, not hostile, not defeated. Genuinely surprised, in the way people get when they find resistance where they expected open space. "You're different," she said finally, and this time it was a real observation, without a strategic layer, from what I expected. "People usually are," I replied. "Good night." I left with a steady stride and straight posture, and only let my shoulders drop 2 centimeters when I turned the corner of the room and moved out of her line of sight. In the car on the way back, Niccolo and I stayed quiet for a while. Doriano drove with his usual discretion, and the city moved past the windows, lights reflecting off the wet asphalt. "She talked to you," he said finally, not a question. "She did," I confirmed. "What did she say?" "That you're efficient with people," I replied, looking out the window. He was quiet for a few seconds, and I felt the shift in the air of the car before he spoke again. "What was between us was real," he said, with that directness that appeared when he decided that detours were a waste. "But it ended because her world and mine became incompatible. She wanted a life I couldn't give her, and I needed something she wasn't willing to give. And now she's back," I said. "And now she's back," he confirmed. "But what ended isn't up for revision just because she came back." I turned toward him in the back seat. We looked at each other in the dark of the car, with the city moving past outside and Doriano pretending he was invisible in the front seat, and between us was that tension that lately had the quality of something getting too big for the space it occupied. He was looking at me with that undivided attention that never apologized for existing, and the low light of the car caught the angle of his jaw, the line of his neck, and I was completely aware of the distance between our knees that was shrinking without either of us having moved. "Item number 1, I said finally, in the quiet voice of someone handing something over. He went still. "I have a file of things I will never do," I went on, looking at him. "Item number 1 is not getting involved with my boss. The font has been gray for 2 weeks. I didn't delete it, but it's gray." The car stopped. I got out before he could answer, and stopped on the sidewalk, and turned around because I had to turn around. Because there was something in that car I needed to see from the outside before deciding what to do with the inside. He was watching me through the window with that expression I had stored since the week of the Rome dinner, and that I now finally had a name for. It was someone who had decided, and who was waiting for me to arrive at the same decision in my own time. I went inside, and behind me, in the car pulling away, I heard Niccolo say Doriano's name once, quietly, and then nothing more. But there was a smile in the silence. I didn't see it, but I felt it. And the gray font stayed gray in a different way, not the gray of doubt, the gray of something on its way. Chapter 8. The Dinner, the Kiss, and the World That Doesn't Stop. On Monday morning, he asked about dinner in the same voice he used to confirm a meeting. I was at my desk with my tablet when he appeared in the doorway of my office. Not the Don in a buttoned suit with his tie in place, but him, with his sleeves slightly rolled up, and that presence that fills a room before any word does. "Dinner tonight," he said. "You have dinner with the Ferreras at—" I started, opening the calendar. "With me," he cut in, voice low and direct. "Dinner with me, not work." I stood there with the tablet in my hand, looking at him, and there was in his face that expression of a man who has made a decision and isn't asking permission, but who is, for the first time, asking for something. "Okay," I said, and I went back to my office before either of us could complicate what was simple for now. He chose a small restaurant in the West Village I had never been to, far from the business venues, far from the suited men and the Italian conversations that stopped when I walked in. A place with wooden tables and low light, and music that didn't call attention to itself. The kind of place you choose when you want the person across from you to be the center of everything, not the setting. "You researched the restaurant," I said when I sat down. "I research when it's worth it," he replied, opening the menu with an ease that didn't conceal the meaning of the sentence. I smiled at the menu before I could stop myself, and didn't bother hiding it because there was no longer any energy left for hiding small things. The dinner was different from anything I had experienced with him until then, and different from anything I had experienced with anyone in a considerable amount of time. The conversation flowed without an agenda, without a structure, without the professional language that had been our idiom for 2 years. He told me about his father, not the interview version, the real version of a man who built an empire and forgot to teach his son how to stop when his body asked for it. I listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, just listened, because sometimes that's what someone needs and no one gives. I told him about my mother, the earring, the way some people leave their mark, not in what they say, but in what we carry after they're gone. He listened with that undivided attention I had learned to recognize as the rarest thing he offered, and that he offered to me with a frequency I had stopped pretending was coincidence. "You don't laugh like that at the office," he said at one point, looking at me with that direct expression that didn't look away. "At the office, you're my boss," I replied. "I'm your boss here too." "Here is dinner," I said. "It's different." "What changes at dinner?" he asked, and there was a low, warm quality in his voice that I didn't hear from him in the office hallways. I looked at him for a second before answering. "The font gets less gray," I said. He went completely still, and then, very slowly, his hand crossed the table and his open palm came to rest over mine, not gripping, not holding, just placed there, warm and steady, with the restraint of a man who has much more to give and is choosing the pace carefully. I didn't pull away. That was when the music changed and we both paused at the same time. I heard the first notes before I understood where I recognized them from, and when I did, I looked up at the ceiling for a second, with that mix of disbelief and inevitability that the universe sometimes delivers. It was the same song, the same one that had been playing on the office radio that Tuesday evening. The evening of my dream is to see him without his pants. The evening that had started everything. "It's the same one," I said quietly. "It is," he confirmed, eyes on me, not looking at the ceiling. Not looking at anything else. "The universe has terrible taste," I said. "Or excellent taste," he replied. I looked at him, and there was something I hadn't seen before with that kind of clarity. Not the Don, not the executive, not the man with the sharp sarcasm and calculated coolness. It was him underneath all of it, without the armor, with the expression of someone allowing himself to be truly seen and not yet sure how that feels. "You're nervous," I said. "I don't use that word," he replied. "It's the right word." The silence that followed was the most honest confirmation he could have given. "Maybe," he admitted finally, in the quietest voice I had ever heard from him. I turned my hand under his palm and we laced our fingers together, and he held on, not tightly, not possessively, with that steadiness of something that has found its place after too long out of it. Outside the restaurant, the city was cold and alive around us, and I had stopped on the sidewalk to check a work message out of reflex, that old habit of always having the phone as an extension of my hand. He stood beside me, unhurried, hands in his coat pockets, the vapor of his breath disappearing into the cold night air. I put the phone away, turned to face him, and he was looking at me in a way that made me forget the cold entirely. It wasn't the office look. It wasn't the look from the car, the break room, the late afternoon hallway. It was deeper than all of them combined. The look of a man who has arrived somewhere after a long time walking and is, finally, still. "Niccolo," I said, in a voice that came out with no volume at all. He took one hand slowly from his pocket, and his fingers rose along my neck with a lightness that was more intense than any pressure could have been. Fingertips at the line of my jaw, his thumb passing softly over my cheek, and I closed my eyes for half a second, because it was too much to process at once. The warmth of his hand on my face against the cold of the night around us. When I opened my eyes, he was closer. I don't know at what point the distance had closed. I only know that there was an entire city around us, and it was gone, and there was the vapor of our breath mingling in the air between us, and there was his hand on my face with that steadiness that promised without pressing. He tilted his head and his mouth found mine. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't tentative. It was direct and honest and inevitable, the way everything he did was, his mouth taking mine with a pressure that started firm and went deeper before I could catch my breath, and I felt his warmth spreading from the point of contact to every edge of my body like fire finding dry surface. His hand left my face and moved down my neck, along the side of my shoulder, stopping at my waist with a pressure that pulled me 2 centimeters toward him. 2 centimeters that were a world, that were 2 years of loosened ties and coffee at the right temperature and undivided attention that I had tried to catalog as neutral and never managed to. I put my hands on his chest, feeling the warmth of the fabric, feeling his heart beating faster than his composure let show, and I answered with everything I had held back for too long, because holding back had been the right choice for a long time, and letting go was the right choice now. When the kiss ended, he didn't pull away immediately. He stayed with his forehead against mine, hand still at my waist, his breathing slightly different from what it had been before, and I kept my eyes closed for a few seconds, because opening them meant the world would come back, and the world could wait a little longer. That was... I started. His phone rang. I opened my eyes. He went still for a second, and I saw in him the same resistance I was feeling, that refusal of the body to leave where it was to go, where the world was calling. Then he looked at the phone, and his expression changed, and I recognized that change. Not coldness. It was the dawn coming back. Because something had called the dawn. "I have to go," he said, in the voice that had apologized before the words came out. "What happened?" I asked. "Work," he said simply, because in his world simple was sometimes all that could be given. Doriano appeared 10 minutes later with the car, and looked at me with the expression of someone who has assessed and already reached a conclusion. "You asked first if he was okay," he said, when I got in. "It's natural," I replied, "before you asked what happened." I stayed quiet, looking out the window, with the taste of the kiss still on my lips, and the hand at my waist still present as a physical memory my body refused to release. "You asked first if he was okay." I had asked first if he was okay, and Doriano didn't need to say anything else, because we both knew what that meant, that the font of item number 1 wasn't just gray, that it had stopped being about a rule and started being about a choice, and that I had made the choice before I realized I was making it. In the 3 days that followed, he was different, more closed off, more wall than sarcasm, present in body and absent in everything that mattered. I gave him space because I had learned to give it, and because there was a difference between pulling away and processing, and I needed to believe it was processing. On Thursday, when I set the coffee on the desk and turned to leave, he said my name. "I don't regret it," he said, before I could ask anything. "The kiss. I just want you to know that." I stopped in the doorway. "But there's something you need to know," he continued, in a voice that had shifted in tone, lower, heavier, about what happened that night. "A rival family is using people close to me as leverage." He looked at me, "And I was foolish enough to show that you matter in the wrong places." The office went silent, and I understood, with that clarity that shows up at the exact moment you least want it, that the most beautiful kiss of my life had come with a price I didn't yet know the size of. Chapter 9. The risk, the distance, and what she decides. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of distance built with the efficiency of someone who knows how to build something that hurts while they're building it. I hadn't been cold, hadn't been hostile. I had been calibrated, which was worse, because calibrated looks natural if you don't know what was there before. I knew, he knew, and the space between us had the texture of something chosen, not something that had simply happened. The truth was that I understood what he had said on Thursday. I understood the logic, understood the risk, understood that a man from his world showing that someone mattered in the wrong places was information with a price, and that the price could be collected in ways I didn't want to calculate. But understanding with your head and feeling it in your chest were two things that didn't sit well together, and my chest was winning the argument with an infuriating consistency. The kiss was still there, not as a distant memory, as a physical thing the body refused to file away, his hand at my waist, the warmth of his mouth, his forehead against mine before the world came back. All of it, intact, and 2 weeks of distance hadn't erased a single detail. It had only added the ache that comes after tasting something good and having to stop. In the second week, Doriano found me in the break room with the expression of someone who arrived with a purpose and is going to see it through whether they're welcome or not. He stood in the doorway for a second, looking at me with the calm of a man who measures every word before putting it in the air. "You stopped wearing the earring," he said. I brought my hand to my ear on reflex, the bare ear, the way it had been every day for the past 2 weeks. I had put the earring away in the nightstand drawer without asking myself why, and Doriano was making me ask now. "I put it away," I said simply. "Why?" he asked, in the voice of someone who already knows the answer but needs it said out loud. I looked at my coffee for a moment before answering. "Because the last place I lost it was at a dinner that went wrong," I said, with the honesty I only used with people who had proven they deserved it. "And I don't want to lose it again." "The earring or—" he started. "Both," I cut in, before he finished, because it was easier to say it outright. "I'm scared of both." Doriano was quiet for a few seconds, and there was in his silence the quality of a man weighing what he was going to say next with more care than usual. "He's handling it," Doriano said finally. "What happened that night? He's working on it." "I know," I said, "and he's not using you as a shield while he does. He's trying to protect you without pushing you away." "I know," I repeated, "but from where I'm standing, Doriano, Protection and distance look the same when you're on the outside looking at a closed door. He stood in the break room doorway for a moment, and then did something I didn't expect. He nodded. Slowly, as if I had said something he couldn't contradict and wasn't going to try. "Fair enough," he said, "and it's stupid of him." "Don't call him stupid." "Why not?" he asked in that tone. "Because..." I stopped and heard what I was about to say before saying it, and went quiet for a second. Doriano waited, with the patience of someone who has already gotten where he wanted to go, and is just waiting for the other person to catch up. "Because it's my job," I said, finally, and those two words held much more than their professional meaning, and we both knew that, and neither of us commented. Doriano left the break room with the expression of mission accomplished, and I stayed with my coffee going cold in my hand, thinking that 2 weeks of calibrated distance had done nothing but confirm what the gray font had already confirmed before. On Thursday evening, I stayed late because of a report that couldn't wait. The floor emptied gradually, and by 8 p.m. it was just me and the light of my desk lamp, and the silence of the office, and the determination to finish what I'd started before going home. I closed my laptop at 8:40, grabbed my bag, my coat, and headed to the elevator with the stride of someone already mentally at home. The hallway was empty, the lights dimmed, and the elevator arrived in 40 seconds. The lobby had that quiet of a commercial building after hours. Empty reception, a security light in the corner, the sound of my own steps on the marble. I was approaching the revolving door when I noticed a man standing outside, just standing, still, looking at the building with that motionlessness that had nothing casual about it. Something in my stomach dropped 2 inches before the thought reached my conscious mind. 2 years alongside Niccolo Angelis had taught me the difference between someone waiting for an Uber and someone who is where they are with intent, and that man was the second kind. I went back to the elevator, went up. Niccolo was in his office. He looked up when I walked in without knocking, and read my expression before I opened my mouth. 2 seconds, just 2, and he was already on his feet. "What happened?" The voice came out low and direct. I told him. The man in the lobby, the stillness, that instinct I had learned not to ignore. He had his phone in his hand before I finished the last sentence. "Doriano, lobby, now." And then, to me, in a voice that had shifted in tone but not in volume, "Stay here, Niccolo," I started. "Please," he said. That word, the word he didn't use. It came out direct. No drama, no negotiation, and that was exactly why I stayed. He stayed with me. Not in the same room. He stayed in the office. I stayed in the conference room with my laptop, and the door between the 2 spaces stayed open, and in that open door was all the communication neither of them was putting into words. I was safe. He knew where I was, and the space between the 2 rooms had the quality of 2 people who had found the balance point that neither the 2 weeks of distance nor the kiss in the West Village had managed to define. Around midnight, I fell asleep on the conference room sofa without realizing it, laptop on my lap and the report half finished. When I opened my eyes, there was low light coming through the window and a dark wool jacket over me. The jacket smelled like his cologne. I lay still, looking at the fabric for a second, then got up slowly and walked to the office doorway. He had slept in the chair, the uncomfortable position of a man who hadn't gone to the sofa because the sofa was taken, head slightly tilted, suit wrinkled, tie completely loosened, and there was in that a vulnerability I wasn't used to seeing in him. Not the Don, not the executive, just a man who had stayed because I was there. He woke up when I got close, opened his eyes, saw me, and for a second, just one, before awareness arrived. The expression on his face was the most unguarded thing I had seen in a long time. "The earring," he said, looking at my bare ear, his voice still thick with sleep. "I put it away," I said. "I know." He straightened in the chair slowly. "Doriano told me what you said in the break room. Doriano talks too much." "Sometimes," he agreed, and there was in his tone that quality that appeared when he was being more human than the Don allowed. "Briella, I'm going to fix it," he said, in his usual direct voice, but with a different weight, more personal. "And when I do, I won't use protection as an excuse for distance anymore." That was an admission of fault, I said. "It was," he confirmed, without hesitating. "You rarely admit fault." "I rarely commit it." The corner of his mouth appeared. That one, the one that had been a problem from the start. "But when I do, I own it." I looked at the jacket still over my arm. Then I went to my bag, opened the small inner pocket, and took out the earring that had been put away for 2 weeks. I put it on, fastened the clasp with my fingers, slowly, and when I looked up, he was watching me with that expression I had learned to recognize as the most honest one he had. "It's okay," I said, quietly. It was the answer to the question he hadn't asked out loud, but that was there, and those 2 words held more than those 2 words. He stayed still for a second. Then, very slowly, he raised his hand and ran his fingertips along my ear where the earring was. A minimal touch, barely any pressure, but one I felt everywhere, before his hand came down along the side of my neck and stopped at my shoulder with that steadiness that was at once presence and promise. His eyes stayed on mine, and in them there was something that was no longer trying to hide. The following Sunday, he knocked on my door without warning. I opened it, and he was there without a suit for the first time I had seen him outside the context of the night before. Dark pants, simple shirt, no jacket, no tie. with the ease of a man who had decided to take the day off from his own character. I stood in the doorway looking at him, and there was something about the way he was, without all the armor, that was simultaneously more accessible and more dangerous than in a suit. "You're not wearing a tie," I said. "Sunday," he replied simply. "A walk," he said, in the direct voice of someone who decided before arriving. "In the park. No agenda, no tablet, just you and me." I stood there for 2 seconds, then I grabbed my coat. "Yes," I said, and I closed the door behind me with the lightness of a font that was getting less and less gray. Chapter 10. Without pants, without the file, and without pretending. The walk lasted 4 hours, and it was the first time in a long while that I didn't check the time once. We walked through the park without a destination, the way you do when no one is in a hurry to get anywhere, with the afternoon cold on our faces, and the city making its background noise the way New York does when it's not paying attention to your life. He told me about his father for real, not the interview version, not the version of the Don who had inherited an empire, but the version of a boy who had learned that strength was the only currency accepted in the world he grew up in, and who had taken too long to understand the cost of that. I told him about my mother, about the earring, about the woman who had taught me that some things you carry on your body, because it's the closest way to stay near someone who is gone. He listened with that undivided attention I had learned to recognize as the rarest thing he offered. And when I finished, he stayed quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone formulating a response, but of someone who has received something and is holding it carefully before giving anything back. "Would you choose differently?" I asked later, when the conversation had come back to his world. "I don't know," he replied, with that honesty that cost something, and that I had learned to recognize by its tone. "I'd choose with more information." "What information?" He glanced at me sideways, and there was in that glance something that was an answer before any word. "That there are things the world I built can't protect," he said, like the desire to walk through a park on a Sunday without calculating who's watching. I stayed quiet for a moment. "But you're walking," I said. "I am," he confirmed, with a corner of his mouth that was different from all the other corners of his mouth. "That's the new part." I made dinner at the apartment, because he had stayed in the kitchen with me while I cooked, leaning against the counter with a glass of water, talking about nothing specific, with a lightness I hadn't associated with him until I started associating it. And there was something in that, in the domestic ease of a man who ran the organized crime of New York leaning against my small kitchen counter without looking out of place, that made me understand that the new part he had mentioned in the park was bigger than I had calculated. We ate at the small kitchen table because the living room felt too formal for how the evening was going. Afterward, on the sofa, I opened my laptop out of habit, and he picked a book off the shelf without asking, and the silence between us had the quality of something that had found its own level, comfortable in a way I hadn't expected it to be, natural in a way that didn't require any effort to sustain. I opened the file on reflex. Things I will never do. Item number 1, gray font, the way it had been for weeks, waiting for the decision I still hadn't made out loud. I read the sentence once, then once more, and then, without drama, without an internal speech, without needing any more time, I selected it and pressed delete. I closed the file, closed the laptop, and sat looking ahead for a second with that specific lightness of something that had been heavy for too long and finally wasn't anymore. "What was that?" he asked, without looking up from his book. "An organizational file," I said. "Something I don't need anymore." He set the book down slowly, looked at me with that full attention, and I saw in his face the exact moment he understood what I was saying. Not the file, but what the file represented. "Briella," he said, in the quietest voice I had ever heard from him. "Item number 1, I said, looking at him, not getting involved with my boss. Deleted. The sofa stayed silent for a long time. Then he set the book on the coffee table and turned his body toward me, and I turned mine, and we sat facing each other with half a meter between us, the last distance that needed to be crossed. "Why?" he asked, in the voice of someone who needs to hear it from me. Not as confirmation, as a declared choice. "Because rules that exist out of fear aren't rules," I said. "They're walls, and I have enough walls without adding one I don't need anymore." He held my gaze for too long to be casual, and too briefly to be everything that look wanted to say, and then he said something I hadn't expected, or had expected, but hadn't known it would arrive that way, with that weight. "You spent 2 years building that wall," he said, in the voice that had that roughness of something felt before it's thought. "For reasons I respect, and you just took it down on a Sunday evening over my book. That means more to me than I'm able to express." "You're nervous again," I said. "Enormously," he confirmed, without looking away. I leaned in. This time I went first. The kiss started soft, not like the one in the West Village, which had been urgent and inevitable, and full of 2 years of wait. This one had a different quality. It was the kiss of a choice, not an explosion. It was me reaching for him deliberately, and him receiving it with that full attention he gave to everything that mattered, and both of us knowing that this time there was no phone going off at the wrong moment, no world calling, no door between us. His hand rose slowly along my arm, palm warm through the thin fabric, and when it reached my shoulder, he pulled me gently toward him, not forcefully, with that steadiness of a man who knows what he wants, and doesn't need to prove anything to have it. I put my hands on his chest and felt his heart beating faster than his composure let show, and there was in that an intimacy greater than anything else, knowing that on the inside, he wasn't as controlled as he appeared. The kiss deepened, and he tilted toward me until I was against the arm of the sofa, and he was over me with one arm braced beside my head, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his body like a blanket before the touch, and I thought, with the last part of my brain still functioning analytically, that I had spent 2 years trying not to imagine this, and the reality was immeasurably better than anything I had imagined. He paused, pulled back 2 centimeters, just 2, enough to look at me, dark eyes and slightly different breathing, and there was in his gaze a question he didn't need to ask in words, but asked anyway. "Are you sure?" he said, in the rough voice of someone holding back with considerable effort, and I thought about 2 years of loosened ties and coffee at the right temperature, and an earring retrieved from a restaurant at 10 at night, and I smiled in a way he understood before any words. "From the beginning," I said. "The night that followed had no adequate words, and I'm not going to try to find them. What I can say is that he was present in a way I hadn't known existed, attentive to every detail, every breath, that specific place on my neck that made everything stop making sense. And there was in his hands a combination of firmness and care that I had no vocabulary for, because the two things don't usually exist together, and in him they did without effort. And at some point in the night, in a quiet early morning with the city outside making its low, familiar hum, I understood that the most skeptical reader of myself, the one who had written item number 1 at 2 in the morning in a small apartment thinking she was protecting herself, had not calculated that protection and captivity are sometimes the same thing, and that letting go could be the most courageous act there is. We woke up with the morning light coming through the apartment windows, and he was awake before me. I could tell by the way his breathing had that quality of quiet alertness, of a man who never fully sleeps, even when he sleeps. "Niccolo," I said, in the voice of someone trying out a name in that context for the first time. He replied, hand in my hair with the absent-minded ease of someone who does it without calculating. "My dream was to see you without your pants," I said. The pause that followed had the quality of contained laughter. "I know," he said quietly. "I was there. And now you know it wasn't just aesthetic. It was never just aesthetic," he replied. "You just needed more time to know it too." "Arrogant," I said. "Consistent." I stayed quiet for a moment, with my head on his shoulder and my hand on his chest, and the morning arriving with that lightness I hadn't known mornings could have. "Niccolo, you're going to keep being dangerous. Yes, and cold in meetings. Necessary, and item number 1 doesn't exist anymore." "It doesn't," he confirmed. "That's okay," I said. "The dangerous and the cold and the sarcastic and the world you have, it's all okay." "Why?" he asked, in the voice of someone who wants the specific answer. "Because you went back for my mother's earring," I said, "and you loosened your tie, and you covered me with your jacket without being asked. That's you, the version of you that exists when you stop calculating." Pause. And I'd choose that version over anything else I've ever seen. The silence that followed was different from every other silence I had learned to read in him. It was full from the inside. "You're going to ruin me," he said very quietly, with that honesty that cost everything. "Probably," I said, "but in a good way. That kind exists? With you, yes." The following Monday, there were 2 coffees on the desk when I arrived. He had come in before me for the first time in 2 years, had made both coffees, had left mine at the right temperature, exactly the way he knew I liked it. The way he knew because he had been paying attention long enough to know, without my ever having had to ask. "You came in early," I said. "Exceptionally," he replied, with the corner of his mouth. To make the coffee. I picked up the cup, took a sip. Right temperature, as always. 2 years of paying attention, I said. "From the beginning," he confirmed. Doriano walked past in the hallway, saw the 2 coffees, saw our expressions, and went straight to the elevator without coming in, with the smile of a man who no longer needs to hide that he's rooting for this. On his phone, he sent a message to Niccolo's group chat with 2 words, 2 coffees. The phone exploded with replies. And in the office, with the morning arriving and the calendar full, and the world outside continuing to be the complicated world it was, I looked at him from across the room, and he looked at me, and between us was that thing with no name that both of us recognized as right. Then, at 11:23 a.m., I went to the break room to get water. The hallway was empty, the team in a meeting, Doriano on the floor below. The break room was quiet, with that dead hour stillness. I reached the counter and saw the envelope before I understood what I was seeing. White. No return address, no name. Placed on the granite with the precision of something that wasn't forgotten. It was left. I stood in the doorway for 2 seconds with my instincts screaming before the thought arrived. I picked it up. Inside was a photograph. Me and Niccolo, on the sidewalk in the West Village. That night, that exact moment before the first kiss. Taken from across the street, at the angle of someone far enough not to be seen, and close enough for every expression to be sharp. On the back, in handwriting, in an elegant script that matched nothing it should have matched. "Congratulations, Ms. Osborne. You've finally become interesting." I stared at the back of the photograph for a time I couldn't measure. The water I had gone to get was still in the pipes. The morning coffee was cold in the cup I had left on the desk. And I understood, with that objective clarity that is the worst kind of understanding, that item number 1 had never been about the job. It had been about this. About the moment when someone from his world decided that I existed, and that moment had arrived. The office went completely quiet. Not the end-of-day silence, not the comfortable quiet that had settled between us over the past few weeks. It was a different kind, the kind with weight, the kind that fills the air before any words do, the kind that says something has changed before anyone confirms it out loud. I watched his face. In 2 years, I had seen Niccolo cold, had seen him sarcastic, relentless, controlled with the precision of a man who had learned that emotion was information, and information in his world had a price. I had cataloged every version, learned to read every layer, reached the point where I could tell what he was feeling before he decided what to show. But this was something else. This was the expression of a man who had found the exact point where the dawn and the man beneath the dawn could no longer exist separately, where the control and what was being controlled finally weighed the same, and neither one was winning. "Niccolo," I said, quieter this time, in the voice I used when I wanted to reach past the armor without attacking it. "Who did this?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the photo in his hand for a second that felt longer than it was, with that stillness of a man arriving at a conclusion and checking whether it holds its weight before putting it in the air. Doriano picked up the envelope by its edge, with the habitual care of someone who preserves evidence by instinct, and studied the paper, the handwriting, the angle of the photograph with the eyes of a man who had spent years reading details other people missed. "This wasn't a random warning," he said, in the low, precise voice of someone being objective because objective was necessary. "It was calculated. The restaurant, the angle, the timing. Whoever did this knew where you were, knew when to leave, knew where to put it so you'd find it, and not him." I crossed my arms, not out of coldness, but out of the need to keep myself together while processing what Doriano was saying. "Then explain it to me," I said, in the firmest voice I had at that moment, which wasn't as firm as I wanted but was what was available. Niccolo raised his eyes from the photo, and that was when I understood the difference. Because in the 2 years before, when he looked at me, it was Niccolo, the boss, the man with the loosened tie, the man who had retrieved an earring from a restaurant at 10 at night and made coffee at the right temperature and used our signal to exit a conversation with his past because I was in the room. It was him, with everything I had learned to recognize as him. What was looking at me now was something else. It was the dawn. The difference was too subtle for someone who didn't know how to look and too large for someone who did. It was in the posture, the angle of the jaw, the way his dark eyes stayed completely still on me without the warmth I had learned to look for in them. It was the man who had built an empire, who had made decisions I would probably never know about, who lived in a world where he calculated consequences before he breathed. And the dawn was looking at me like I was the consequence he hadn't calculated in time. "They didn't leave that photo here just to scare you," he said, in the voice that had dropped to a level I didn't know yet, which was more dangerous precisely because it didn't rise. Pause. The kind of pause that exists when what comes next is going to change something. "Then why?" I asked. He looked at the photo, then at me, and there was in that sequence of glances, photo, then her, photo, then her, something that told me he was measuring how ready I was to hear it before he spoke. When he answered, his voice came out low, dangerous, with the quality of something said with precision, because every word had been chosen. Because the moment someone discovered what you mean to me, pause. I felt my stomach drop before I understood why, the way the body processes information before the mind catches up. Niccolo took a step toward me, slowly, with that deliberateness he used when he wanted me to hear what was coming next with my full attention. "You became the only piece they need to touch to make me bleed from the inside without ever having to come near me." The office went completely quiet, and it was exactly in that moment, with the photo in his hand, and the elegant handwriting on the back and the name on the envelope that was mine and not his, that I understood I had calculated everything wrong from the start. I had spent 2 years with item number 1 because I was afraid of falling for my boss. I had built a wall, kept my distance, resisted with every ounce of efficiency I had because I believed the danger was that, the feeling, the choice, the vulnerability of wanting someone from his world, but the feeling was never the danger. The danger was what happened when his world found out the feeling existed, and Niccolo Angelis's world had already found out. Well, that was the story, and as you've probably guessed, it doesn't end there. The good news is that part 2 is already out. To access part 2 and see how the story continues, it's super simple. Just click the first link in the pinned comment below. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click the very first link down in the comments, and part 2 will be right there waiting for you. It's that easy. I'm Lena, and I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Just click the link in the first pinned comment.